Before we get into Final Fantasy Versus XIII, I'm going to go over some of the history of the franchise for those that may be unfamiliar to help give a better understanding. Final Fantasy, one of the most recognizable names in the role-playing domain of gaming. If you're a fan of the genre, you've likely at least ventured into trying one of its grandiose in nature titles. Even if you're not a fan of RPGs, there's little doubt that the name is anything but familiar. Square Enix, at the time known simply as Square in Japan, and later known as Squaresoft in the West, would birth the series on December 18th, 1987 on the Nintendo Entertainment System, more commonly referred to as the NES or NES. Given the name Final Fantasy because at the time its creator Hironobu Sakaguchi was using it as his last attempt at creating a successful game within the company. If it had been unsuccessful, he would have given up working on games and pursued finishing his education at university. Due to the major success of the series, it has continued to spawn multiple entries, with the latest being the second part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, Rebirth, which has been received positively by critics and the majority of players. Each main sequentially numbered title follows its own story with no connection to the ones before it. Occasionally some games do connect to an existing title, but that's not the usual formula. In essence, it can be described as an anthology series. On December 17th, 2009, Final Fantasy XIII was released on the PlayStation 3 in Japan, followed by a worldwide release on March 9th, 2010. This marked the first main entry from the franchise to be launched on the console. It was praised for its high quality visuals and cutscenes while receiving criticism for its linear gameplay, as players were accustomed to past entries that offered more open exploration. The game would also launch the Fabuda Nova Chrysalis, an umbrella designed at the time to house a collection of titles, including the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, also known as the Lightning Saga. It was also set to include Type 0, Agito, and Awakening. Once upon a time, this umbrella, which was meant to loosely connect the other games through a shared mythos, was also set to include another title, Final Fantasy Versus XIII, which I'll refer to simply as Versus from here on out. First announced at E3 alongside Final Fantasy XIII on May 8th, 2006, Versus was originally planned as a PlayStation 3 exclusive under the directorship of Tetsuya Nomura, whom would begin his journey at Square as a games debugger, eventually making his way onto the team allocated to Final Fantasy, where he would create art assets and become a character designer, creating the likeness for those such as Sephiroth, Cloud Strife, Vincent Valentine, Squall Leonhardt, Tidus, Lightning, just to name but a few. Whilst he was handling director responsibilities for Versus, he was also serving as a character designer for the project, creating the look of Noctis, whom would be seen in an outfit also designed by Nomura, which according to interviews was always supposed to be a placeholder, because at some point Square Enix entered into partnership with Rowan, a Japanese fashion company, to produce clothing designs for the in-game characters, including Noctis. Nomura's design, which would prove to be popular by fans, was unfortunately replaced by one of Rowan's. The game was originally being developed on the Crystal Tools engine, but alternatively later in 2011, due to technical difficulties, it would be moved to the Luminous engine to create the gameplay aspects. Both of these being Square Enix in-house engines, Luminous would be used in the creation of tech demos Agni's Philosophy and Witch Chapter 0. Later it would be used in the creation of Final Fantasy 15 and the more recent title Forspoken. Crystal Tools would still be used in combination with Luminous to handle the real-time graphics for Versus. Based on reports and what was openly discussed by developers, the gameplay was set to have the player traverse a large open world. One can imagine this would be accompanied by the classic elements of an RPG, including high levels of exploration, going from the wilderness to dungeons and small to large towns and cities, conversing with NPCs, undertaking a long line of quests, be it secondary for the sake of leveling up, and those driving the story forward. Different methods of traversal would be offered, ranging from foot, car, possibly chocobos, and airships, which were at one point confirmed. Combat was mentioned to be styled after the likes of Kingdom Hearts, meaning it would have been action-based, seemingly with the ability to control other party members and be able to commandeer weapon-based vehicles, for example, mechs works. Some may wonder, why was it called Versus 13? Well, the Versus part had a few reasons, but in simple terms, it relates to the game being a counter to Final Fantasy 13. For example, 13 has a more fantasy-based world, Versus would have had a more realistic setting. 13 had a turn-based style battle system, Versus was to be real-time. 13 was about following fate, whilst Versus was said to be about fighting against fate. There are more reasons, but these examples give a basic understanding as to why Versus was part of the title. Its tagline, a fantasy based on reality, relates in part to the game world, one comparable to ours in appearance, whilst also incorporating fantasy elements. If we look at the announcement teaser, we can see Noctis stepping out into a modern city. This is likely the first public glimpse we see of Insomnia, also known by its secondary title, the Crown City in Final Fantasy 15, which was originally conceived for Versus. This teaser would also feature Noctis making use of his teleportation abilities to warp himself between a squadron of soldiers. He could also be seen able to materialize weapons that would surround him, allowing himself to defend from incoming attacks, whilst also being able to throw these weapons, warp to the location of impact, and follow up with a barrage of his own attacks. Another connecting factor to the reality aspect was that Nomura wanted the game to be darker in nature than traditional Final Fantasy games. One way he felt this could be achieved was by relating the game's themes to real-world issues. As is the Final Fantasy way, the cast of characters would be expansive. Some familiar names for those that played Final Fantasy 15 include Ignis, Prompto, and Gladiolus. Like in Final Fantasy 15, they were to function as the entourage of the prince and accompanying party members of the player. Regis, the father of Noctis, at this time was still designed to be the king of Lucis. Aranea, though her role is unknown, I'd assume she would have likely still served as an antagonist to some extent, as a clip from a trailer shows her seemingly in confrontation with Noctis. Arden, with his role also being unknown in this iteration. Instead of Luna Freya, another character would be in her place. Stella Nox Fleuret, she would have served as the love interest, whilst also serving to some extent as an antagonist, as she can be seen commencing combat against Noctis in a trailer. She would have had similar abilities to him, at least in regards to the ability to manifest weapons. Stella would have been part of the nation known as Tenebrae, and of course Noctis. There isn't a lot of information around to come to a full conclusion to how he may have been presented, so some guessing work is required. From what I've looked through and read, his personality would have possibly been similar to that of which we received in Final Fantasy 15. The trailers and limited gameplay we saw kind of gave me this sense as well. However, in Versus, his family was to have been somewhat like the Mafia, so it could be expected that he possibly would have had at times a more cold and calculating side to him, as it's likely certain expectations for how he'd have acted would have been weighed upon him by his father. Again, this game would have had deep roots into the aforementioned Fabula Nova Chrysalis, so it would have introduced shared themes, including the Kingdom of the Dead. What exactly is that? Well, if we look at Final Fantasy 13, which was to share that same mythos as Versus, we are told it relates to a plane called the Unseen Realm, which in short is the afterlife. So, why is this important? Well, those cool powers that Noctis and Stella possess are connected to said realm. This occurs because both had seen the light of the Kingdom of the Dead, which in turn bestows powers upon them. One needs to apparently have had a near-death experience for this phenomenon to occur. The theme of death also extended to the nation of Lucis, home to the Crown City, where its citizens worship the goddess Etro, i.e. the goddess of death. So it can be surmised Lucis would have felt very dark and likely gothic in tone, perhaps even appearing somewhat satanic. The Caelan family were also said to have favoured only black clothing and ensembles. Lucis, along with 3 other nations, one of them being Tenebrae, held a crystal that they relied on for their needs. However, greed and the desire for greater power led to war as they attempted to seize each other's crystals. It's not clear if Lucis was involved in this war, because as a result, all but Lucis lost their crystal. Moving forward, the other nations shifted their focus to developing and expanding their military technologies. Eventually, due to a combination of political and resource-related issues, a Cold War arose. During this time, the other nations, led by Tenebrae, sought to storyline in an effort to seize the remaining crystal from Lucis. This would have laid the foundation for the story, which according to character designer Roberto Ferrari, was in a constant state of flux, changing every few months. There aren't a great many details known for the story. We do know how the game was likely to have opened based on information available and trailers. Because of the war for their crystal, Lucis had become by choice an isolated nation. However, due to ongoing negotiations, Lucis and Tenebrae had agreed to broker a peace. A peace treaty signing would be underway, seeing a celebratory party taking place to commemorate the event. This would be the first time, at least in-game, Noctis and Stella would meet, Stella conversing about a legend among her people. From this, Noctis would realize they possibly shared a connection. They'd both had a near-death experience and had seen the light of the kingdom of the dead. At some point during this event, it would become evident that the peace treaty signing was simply a deception, as Niflheim forces would lay siege to the sea. Noctis and his entourage would have fought their way through the streets of Insomnia as forces pushed towards their objective, obtaining the crystal. A figure cloaked in white would have jumped into the fray, whom also had the power to wield the crystal. This is likely where Noctis would also have had a combat encounter with Stella. If you think this sounds familiar, you'd be right. This flows in a similar manner to Final Fantasy XV Kingsglaive, a movie acting as a prequel, which would see the invasion of Insomnia during a peace treaty signing, which would also be a ruse to obtain the crystal. There are supposed leaks for the story out there. I couldn't find any information to back them up, and so I can't confidently say they're actually legitimate, so I'm choosing to skip past those. However, I will include some screenshots for those interested. Feel free to pause and read them. So, what happened to the game? The journey of developing Versus was a long and troubled one. As mentioned, the game began development back in 2006, with the team behind Kingdom Hearts working on it, so lack of experience from a development team likely wasn't the case. It's known that the original engine Crystal tools could be difficult to work with and would cause constant issues during not only the development of Versus but also 13. Some of these issues included little to no documentation on its usage, various teams trying to expand the engine's features to help with other projects, but being seemingly impossible to incorporate said features into the engine, assets being created that would turn out to be incompatible, difficulties trying to handle large open world style environments, and the list goes on. Eventually, former devs from Sega would be brought in to design and develop the Luminous engine. The gameplay mechanics for Versus would be moved to this. Throughout development, when not having engine related issues, it's said that the Versus team would continually be moved around to help with other projects, most notably during 13's development to help propel its production. This brings me to Tetsuya Nomura. Again, at the time he was the director. A game director, like in any other field, for example film, is in charge of overseeing the entire project while making key decisions to elements such as the story and art direction, to name a few, while also trying to make sure it proceeds to meet deadlines on time and so forth. It becomes obvious that something wasn't going to plan with the flow of the project, and while some may not like it, Nomura was ultimately a factor in this equation, as it was his job to keep on a well-balanced forward projection. However, based on it being in development hell, which it was, because from 2006 to 2012, Versus was still said to be at a maximum of only 25% completion, which is an absurdly slow growth rate. There are games that have taken longer, but still, 6 years for 25% is pretty bad. Back in 2012, rumors would be floating around as to the cancellation of the game. The Square CEO at the time, Yoichi Wada, would attempt to make light of the situation, mentioning that he had just been in a meeting and the game was indeed doing well. This apparently was not the case, because that same year, production of Versus as it was halted completely. It would then be restructured and retitled to Final Fantasy XV. Hajime Tabata would replace Nomura. Instead of it being a PlayStation 3 exclusive, it would now be a multi-platform release and launched on November 29th, 2016. There are more details out there that I haven't included, fan theories that have been crafted over the years, some which fall into the realm of conspiracy or spread simply due to plain dislike for some of the people that were involved in the development of Versus. In conclusion, I think the ultimate ultimate reason why Versus ceased to be was a combination of three of the reasons I mentioned, those being the game engine, because having as many issues as the team had with it would stall development numerous times and would be detrimental to the progress of any game. The team, which was constantly being thinned out and moved around to help with other projects, again halting any real progress for lengthy periods of time. And thirdly, Nomura. It's harder to pinpoint what happened with him exactly, as this is where it tends to get a bit sketchy, as it seems Square had put something of a gag order on him, as it appears he was instructed not to talk about Versus, not even able to mention it by name once it had been removed from its development. This became somewhat apparent during a live stream when commenting on the original costume for Noctis that he had designed being released as DLC for Dissidia NT, in which he made mention he wasn't sure he was allowed to talk about Versus. From what I've read, it would make sense for Square to be angry with him. A lot of time, resources, and I'm sure money was lost with the production of Versus. Perhaps this, along with replacing him on the project, was their way of punishing him. You might be thinking, why wouldn't they just fire him instead? Well, Japan has this thing called lifetime employment. Being fired does happen, it's just rare. It's more likely the person in question would be punished. There are some interesting stories pertaining to this subject, especially in the gaming industry. I recommend looking into it if that interests you. I also wonder if Nomura had allowed feature creep to run rampant. For those unfamiliar with this concept, feature creep is basically when features are continually added outside of the scope of what was intended, and they just keep piling up until the project becomes bloated, unmanageable, and interrupts the overall progress of the game. Looking at some of the gameplay trailers, it did look like there was a lot going on at times, so if this was part of the game's overall production problems, I wouldn't be surprised. We did get a release in the form of Final Fantasy XV, which I enjoyed. However, it's disappointing that we never got Nomura's original vision, as Versus was the reason I, and I'm sure others, initially purchased the PlayStation 3. With that said, we've covered the beginnings, some but not all of the troubles, and the fall of what could have been an amazing game. I'd like to end this video by thanking you for watching. I wish you all well, and for now, goodbye.